To go, Susan.
So welcome everyone. I am Susan Smythe. I am a member of the academic section for the American College of Cardiology, and we are delighted to host one of our monthly webinars. Today's topic is, so you see yourself as a clinical trialist, and we are joined as usual by two experts in the field that are going to share their perspectives and their advice and tips for all of us on how we can become clinical trialists or better clinical trialists following in their wonderful examples. And so I will just remind everyone that you can use the chat to enter questions. We really do want to have an interactive exchange and have saved a good amount of time at the end for your questions and comments. And so please be entering those in the chat, both as our presenters are speaking and then following their comments. The other thing that I would like to remind everyone is that we have been holding a series of heart tanks for cardiovascular investigators. And at the ACC, we're having a live match off of the three winners over the course of the last year. And so they will be going head to head against one another in their respective areas of cardiology, pitching their research ideas to an expert panel that will select the final winner from the year of our heart tanks. And we are getting ready after ACC 22 to start heart tanks again through the webinar series. And so I just encourage all of you to consider attending that session of your ACC. It really should be the match off of all of our great presentations from our investigators who've been pitching their research ideas across the year. And so with that, turning back to today's topic around seeing yourself as a clinical trialist, I am delighted to be joined by Andy Goldtree, who is like me, a member of the academic section, and I will turn things over to Andy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Smythe, and welcome everyone. I'm Andy Goldtree. I'm an interventional cardiologist at the University of Nebraska Medical Center and governor of the ACC chapter here in Nebraska. We are very fortunate today to be joined by two experts in clinical trials, Dr. David Moliterno and Dr. Laura Mauri. Dr. Moliterno will be speaking first. By way of introduction, Dr. Moliterno is the Jack M. Gill Chair and Professor for the Department of Medicine at the University of Kentucky, and he's a member of the interventional cardiology faculty there. Dr. Moliterno received his bachelor's degree with honors from the University of Michigan, go Blue, his medical degree from the Medical College of Virginia, and did his internal medicine training at Vanderbilt before a cardiology fellowship at the University of Texas Southwestern. He then completed additional training in interventional cardiology at the Cleveland Clinic and remained there as an attending cardiologist for 10 years before moving to the University of Kentucky in 2004. Dr. Moliterno is a fellow of the American College of Cardiology, as well as the European Society of Cardiology and the Society for Cardiovascular Angiography and Interventions. He was the editor-in-chief for CAF-SAP3 and CAF-SAP4, and is, of course, the editor-in-chief of JACC Cardiovascular Interventions. He's the author or co-author of more than 350 publications and 70 book chapters. In particular, relevant to our present conversation, he's been the primary author of publications in Circulation, JACC, JAMA, Lancet, and the New England Journal of Medicine. And as a researcher, he's been involved with numerous multinational investigational studies in cardiovascular medicine as principal investigator or as a member of the steering committee, including trials with funding of over $1 billion. So we're very pleased to have Dr. Moliterno with us today to speak to us about clinical trial leadership.
Andy, are you able to hear me?
Loud and clear.
So your introduction was so long, my internet actually shut down for a moment there. So I'm at a lake house, as you can tell by the the colored background here, so I'm not in the city. So if I lose connection, Susan or Laura, if you can just jump in for me. Well, thanks very much for the kind and lengthy introduction. I don't have slides, so I'll probably ramble for 5 or 10 minutes. I'll try not to go too long. Dr. Smythe knows me well, and she knows I can talk a lot, but I'll try to be brief because I do think the value of programs like this is more the exchange back and forth, because I don't know, where you're coming from and what your specific interests are. But I think one of the things that hit me as Andy was making that long introduction is just that. If you're really passionate about becoming a clinical trialist, you may need to get education in several different geographies or pursue different opportunities out there. So yes, I've done a fellowship at UT Southwestern, but was very much interested in clinical trial research, and so went then to the mecca of that and worked with Eric Topol for a number of years. So I think that's my first point, is you got to first assess your geography and see what the opportunities are around you. And they may be quite different. So for example, there may be a formal pathway if you're at a university or near a university medical center, even if they don't have a large cardiovascular clinical trial network. There may be opportunities, for example, to get a master's degree in public health or clinical epidemiology or in clinical trial science. I know a number of programs are moving towards clinical trial science for a master's degree, and in those you'll get a lot of the basics of epidemiology, statistics or biostatistics, and then some trial design. If you don't have that opportunity, then I think it's trying to figure out if you want to move to it or if you want to try to grow where you're planted. And what I mean by that is if there's any ongoing clinical trial research at the place you're located, get involved. Now that may not be on the side. So for example, it may be volunteering to be part of the IRB. One of the attractions to being on an IRB is then you're getting to review a bunch of protocols by others, and you're sitting in a committee where you're hearing those protocols debated, strengths pointed out, weaknesses pointed out, and you'll learn from that. The next broad thing I would say is piggyback onto others wherever you can. So if you're someplace that is already doing clinical trial research, you may not be at the forefront of it, but just piggyback onto others' work where that's possible. If there's a lab that's already quite functional, doing maybe some basic or translational science work, try to figure out how that strength of that lab may apply to your clinical arena, and how you can bridge with that. There are a number of passive things that you can do, not just by reading manuscripts. In fact, there are some journals that are solely dedicated to clinical trial design. I know in the cardiology space, beyond a couple journals that do that, there's the American Heart Journal, which is a favorite place for many people to go with their clinical trial design papers. And so if you just get in the habit of reading those, you'll start gathering the nuances of what it takes to putting together a clinical trial. Again, though, if you're on your own, I think you can try to become facile in databases. There are a number that are publicly available, such as the National Inpatient Sample, the National Readmission Database, Medicare, the VA health system has one. Trying to figure out who your partners are. Is there somebody else with whom you can work who's a very good statistician, or somebody who has experience who can help guide you? Okay, if you have none of that, you have nothing like that, and you're totally an island, I would figure out what you do have, maybe as a unique population. So for example, here in central Kentucky, we're a hub, say, for cystic fibrosis. Why? Because there's not another major center in the area that's caring for cystic fibrosis, just as one example. And so if I were someone trying to get started in clinical trials, I would try to get that population, figure them out, and then figure out what trials they might be able to be part of. There are other opportunities, and that's, say, reviewing abstracts. And you may not be reviewing something for, for the very top cardiovascular science program in the world, but start anywhere you can reviewing abstracts. And in reviewing abstracts, you'll start, reading, again, different designs, different populations, different ways to approach things. And so I think these are all opportunities that you could pursue, a lot of random thoughts, and some of them I think we can come back to in the discussion and in the Q&A. But I'll just pause there, Andy, and see if you want others to jump in at the moment.
Sure. A reminder to everyone attending, questions can be put in the chat box. We would love to get everyone involved in the conversation. I think those are some really excellent points, Dr. Moliterno, in terms of ways to start clinical research, even in the absence of significant resources. I wonder if you might say a couple of words about networking in the clinical trial space. As you say, clinical trials are very challenging in a vacuum. And so for people who are interested in building a network and kind of getting plugged in, how much you recommend people get started?
Yeah, so networking is important, and I think I would then go to maybe your specific interest if you have one. Say it's an atrial fibrillation, then I would just try to get involved with whatever atrial fibrillation networks, clubs, societies, work groups there are. The American College of Cardiology, for example, has an open door for a number of councils and scientific groups. This is one of them here you're involved with. So I'd say getting plugged in with those and then just networking like at the national meetings coming up in Washington, D.C. in just a couple of weeks.
Excellent. David, if I could ask, what was there a moment in which you realized that you wanted to pursue a career as a clinical trialist, sort of an aha where it all came together, or was it more of a gradual process? Can you talk to us a little bit about your personal journey?
Yeah, thanks so much. And so, I did one of the strategies that I talked about. That was the grow or planted. And Susan, you know the story a little bit. I was at UT Southwestern and it was on a T32. And so I did have a protected year. And so I was able to work with David Hillis in the cath lab. But then in addition, the Brown and Goldstein group was there, and Helen Hobbs had a very active laboratory. And so it was for me then, learning how to write an IRB protocol, learning how to, get funding from a pharmaceutical company, an unrestricted grant, and then literally doing everything myself, collecting the blood and centrifuging, liquid nitrogen, snap freezing, pulling it back out, thawing it, running assays, things like that. But I came to appreciate that was a lot of work. I mean, that took several months and got 2 manuscripts out of it. And so when I saw the work that Eric Topol was doing, where he had thousands and thousands of patients in these prospective randomized studies, I thought, oh my gosh, that's really the king or the master at the time. And so I think once I met with Eric, and he was just so full of energy and so enthusiastic, and literally told me, look, this is a candy shop with more candy than you can ever eat. Come here. And so, but what Eric taught me, I think, was, and others have been exposed to this, so there's, Gene Grunwald, or back then Doug Weaver, or many others, was that there is what I would call entrepreneurial clinical trial. And that is, you learn to become very efficient and try to, work to your top of your game and let other people around you do the things that they're good at, whether it's a clinical trial coordinator, whether it's a research nurse, whether it's a statistician, whether it's financial people. And ultimately you learn, once you've gained all these talents and skills and experience, then being able to evolve to the next level. But like I started my answer with, you have to first write your own protocol. You have to first go to your own IRB meeting. You have to first consent your own patients, collect samples. And once you learn those things, then I think for me, the aha moment, Susan, was being able to then synergize and keep doing more and more and more. And then it becomes less onerous, I guess, once you can get some momentum.
Let me ask you a question, if you don't mind, Dr. Moliterno, about the progression. So you've made it. You're a site investigator at a $50 million study at 120 institutions, but you're not Dave Moliterno yet, right? How do you make the transition from site PI to study PI?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and I've got 2 or 3 answers. But let me just say this one that Susan and others have taught me in life, and that's not trying to be perfect at everything, but really try to focus on just several things and do the best you can with them. And so that's one of the things when I came to the University of Kentucky a lifetime ago, was they were participating in many studies, though in my opinion, not well. And so what I would say is, don't sign up and be a site PI for 15 trials if you've only got the bandwidth to be the site PI for 1 or 2 trials. So I would say, again, look at your patient population, look at your local resources, look at your own time, and just concentrate on 1 or 2, and really do your best then to be the lead enroller. So I can remember in the late 1990s, we actually did a small intro research study that showed that patients were 3 to 4 times more likely to agree to be part of a clinical trial if the attending physician, or a physician at least, went and talked to the patient about enrolling into that study versus having a nurse or a coordinator go and talk to that patient. And so, that for me was an aha moment to go and get involved specifically with study and become dedicated to it. And I think that, just like the ischemia trial here at little old University of Kentucky, David Booth was one of the authors on that New England Journal of Medicine paper. Why? He committed himself to it. He got a large number of patients enrolled, and for that, then he became more involved with the study and ultimately became, one of the authors on the manuscript. So, and it's not going to be the first time. I can remember when Jim Willerson was the editor of Circulation. I must have reviewed 50 or 100 manuscripts for that journal, and never once was invited to be on the editorial board. It was only, after getting involved with several journals and really doing hundreds of reviews that I ultimately was asked by Tony DeMaria to join the editorial consultative board for Jack a number of years ago.
Great. Well, we want to continue this conversation, but I think we also want to bring Dr. Mauri into the conversation. So let's keep moving forward. Let me introduce Dr. Mauri. I apologize if the introduction is too long. At least I apologize in advance. But Dr. Laura Mauri is the Senior Vice President and Chief Clinical and Regulatory Officer at Medtronic. In this role, she leads Medtronic's global clinical research and regulatory affairs functions and is a member of the Medtronic Executive Committee. Dr. Mauri joined Medtronic in September of 2018 and has been the executive sponsor of the company's Clinical Research Council that convenes Medtronic's global clinical research leaders across all product areas. Prior to her role at Medtronic, Dr. Mauri was a practicing interventional cardiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital for 15 years. She's an internationally renowned investigator and professor, she is an internationally renowned investigator, and she was a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, and really helped to shape clinical evaluation of new medical technology. She's an expert in trial design, strategy, and data analysis, and led numerous clinical trials to evaluate novel cardiovascular devices and pharmaceuticals, and held an array of leadership positions, including serving as the chief scientific advisor for the Harvard Clinical Research Institute. Dr. Mauri received her bachelor's degree from Harvard College and her MD from Harvard Medical School, as well as a master's of science in clinical epidemiology from the Harvard School of Public Health. She completed her residency in internal medicine and fellowships in cardiology and interventional cardiology at Brigham and Women's Hospitals. She is a member of the American Society of Clinical Investigation, the Association of University Cardiologists, and a fellow of the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association, and the Society for Cardiovascular Angiography and Interventions. She's authored more than 200 original articles and has served as a senior editor for the journal Circulation. It is a great pleasure to have Dr. Mauri here to share insights with us on her career trajectory and advice for those who may follow.
Thanks, Andy. Really enjoyed listening, Dave, to your thoughts, and so many of them resonated. I mean, one just before I even start is just that being a clinical trialist is like anything else, right? You have to love the work of it. I mean, you have to love everything about think about what the parts are that you love and really just put yourself into it, whether it's, spending every extra ounce of energy enrolling that next patient, or it's designing or writing about the clinical trials. Some of us like every single part of that equation, and that's the fun part of it. But maybe I'll just start with my, how I became interested in clinical trials, because it wasn't necessarily a given, something that I set out to do from the beginning. I actually started looking at the clinical trials, just probably the ones that you're talking about, Dave, that you started with, working with Eric Topol. When I was a medical student, I had come more from a basic science background. And I had some idea of what I was interested in, but I really didn't even know at that time that I was interested in cardiology. But one of the things that we used to do as students was just to read all the classic, sort of groundbreaking large trials that were being done, whether it was about lytics, about statins, about ACE inhibitors, and just to see, how each of those was a story that built on the next one. And the surprises that happened in some of those trials, of the unusual findings and how they were explained and how they triggered the next investigation. And so, I just thought that was fascinating. And then once I got interested in clinical care and cardiology, I remember I used to carry around this little book that maybe you remember. I think it was Cindy Grimes and others who had written this little manual that had summaries of all the pivotal clinical trials at that time. This was back in the 90s. And then because I was at around the Brigham and the Harvard teaching hospitals, I had the chance to see the TIMI trials, as a medical student, and see patients getting enrolled, and my own patients getting enrolled, and seeing just that full spectrum of that bench to bedside was really what attracted me initially to clinical trials. And I eventually found out that I liked that connection that I saw better than being on the bench side, and that's that really shifted me towards that. And I was lucky. You talked about being in a place and taking advantage of the opportunities around you. I totally agree. I mean, you have to just sort of be opportunistic about that. And I was fortunate to have so many really amazing trialists, whether it was from Brownwald to Mark Pfeffer and Paul Ridker in general cardiology, and then in interventional cardiology. My mentors were Don Baim and Rick Kuntz, who I think you worked with closely as well. And seeing that model of how do you put it together, it's unique, I think, as to each of your situations. But I think having role models to say, this is a career that I can envision, I can put together to aspire to, is really meaningful, and also to help guide you away along your way and making choices, because I think the point that you made about focus is a really important one. It's more important to succeed at one or two things than it is to split your resources. And I think if there's anything that I counseled my mentees when I was training clinical trialists, it was that focus. And one is finding an environment where you can have that focus, where you're allowed to have some focus on clinical trials, and that requires the support of some time and from your institution, some understanding from your partners in your practice, maybe even volunteering their own patients to be enrolled in your trials. And then for you, making choices in how you spend your time, and because it is something that requires, it's more than a day-to-day activity. It can be an extracurricular thing as well, right? Because you're reading all the time and you're writing, and that strengthens your ability to become a strong investigator, if that's what you want to do. So there are many pathways, I think, to take. I do think that taking advantage of training programs is a great way to go. I was fortunate to be able to, as part of my fellowship, do a master's in clinical epidemiology, and so bringing strong clinical training together with sort of that more quantitative aspects of how trials are done. It's a nice way to be able to then carry that on to, okay, what are the problems that you see in clinical practice, and how would you go about answering them? And as you said, Dave, it might be unique to what you're seeing in your own practice, and you might choose to do that in industry-sponsored trials, or maybe independent site studies within one site, or perhaps it's by being part of a network of sites for a particular disease state. But there are so many options. And I think the only other thing I'll say, when I think that might be helpful now that I'm sitting in from the perspective of somebody who's moved from academia to industry, some of you might wonder, what is it that's required to be selected as a site, when we're thinking about getting involved in clinical trials. And certainly there's a lot of research and development that's sponsored by industry. And I think the main thing that we look for is the ability to enroll, but also to produce high quality information, right? So it's the reliability and the integrity of the data that's really key as well. And while part of that is looking to past experience, right? Past experience is a way for us to be able to look and see how sites have performed in the past or how investigators have performed in the past. I think, there are opportunities to get a start, and then that focus and that attention to being responsive and attentive to the quality of information is really key. So those are the things that I would start out with, but I'm glad to go on other topics, Andy and Susan, as you want to lead the conversation.
That's fantastic, and it's really fantastic to kind of hear your story as your career has really progressed and skyrocketed. I wonder if you might provide a little more of your relatively unique perspective on the transition from academia to industry. In particular, you're a clinical trialist. You were a clinical trialist in academia, and you're very much a clinical trialist in industry. And I think industry careers are often overlooked by many cardiologists. So I wonder if you might speak a little bit about your work as a clinical trialist from the industry side.
Yeah, I think it's been hasn't been a difficult transition. I guess fundamentally, I think it's being passionate about taking technology to the bedside that really motivated me both in my academic career as well as in my industry career. I don't practice now, so I don't actually use devices at the bedside anymore, but the excitement of seeing something developed and then carried through to a reality, I think is really what made the transition easy. I think having, some of the things that Dave touched on, I think are really interesting, which are all the different parts that need to come together for a trial to be successful. And I think that's also true from the industry perspective, right? So when one runs a trial, whether it's in academics or industry, one has to think about all the practicalities of the contracting, the finances of it, but the mechanics of, is this going to work in somebody's workflow in their clinical practice? Is it going to make sense even to consent patients? What's that going to be like? And how is that consent written? Is this streamlined in a way that's practical enough that, it's not taking hours and hours from the clinician to be able to do? So all of these things are really the nuts and bolts of clinical trials, whether you're in academics or in industry, or you're an investigator participating in a multi-site trial, or even running your own. So I actually think it's been pretty seamless, that transition. And then I guess I would say, in terms of the mindset of a trialist applies, across multiple different fields. Of course, you need to pull in that expertise, just as Dave was saying. You need to pull in the expert statistician for a particular method, perhaps. Or, for instance, I work in many different disease states now. I'm not going to be the expert in endocrinology or, gastric bypass surgery to be able to know the nuances of, is this actually going to fly at the bedside? Is this going to address the problems that physicians are seeing? We need to pull in that expertise. So I think having that, really having some open-mindedness and humility to saying, hey, I don't know all these things myself, and I need to pull in all these different experts, but coordinate that into a single package. I think that's the fun part of trials, and it extends into my role that I have right now.
Excellent. Well, that's an exciting role. I mean, clearly you've moved from certainly a leader in our field to a leader in many fields in that space. I wonder if I might ask a question for both Drs. Mauri and Moliterno about dollars and cents. Clinical trials cost a lot of money. And there are different places one can find that money, whether it's private foundations, industry, government. But I wonder if you might each speak a little bit about how investigators interested in getting more involved should go about begging for spare change.
Well, gosh, I can start. It's an open-ended question. It really depends on, what you're hoping to accomplish, I guess. And sometimes you start with the budget, and sometimes you finish with the budget. And just like Dr. Mauri was, intimating, there's a lot of different parts that you need to understand that are they going to come together? Is this something you can do at the bedside? Well, if you don't have the dollars, it's not going to happen. So that certainly is part of it. The old joke used to be when calculating the sample size of the study, you looked at the total budget and then the cost per patient, and you divided the two, and you came up with how many patients were going to be in the study. I'm being a little bit facetious, but no, that's a reality. And not uncommonly, you'll start with what is already covered, say, by insurance, or what is deemed to be routine and customary versus what are you yourself testing. And then you, of course, have to figure out in the background, what is the IRB going to charge you? How much is the cost per patient according to the coordinator or the research organization that's doing it for you? But your question was with regard to getting the money. And so, that again, there's two different ways to approach that. One is to figure out what are your local interests, patients, such like that, and then go out looking for the money. The opposite is figuring out where the money is. Maybe it's a grant that's available, or maybe it's a VA hospital, or maybe it's a federal government. There's a number of resources, and then see what they're interested in supporting, and then obviously applying for that grant and not doing the full study until you have grant funding, but having enough perhaps to start doing a pilot project or some preliminary data.
Yeah, so I think it starts with the question that you're trying to answer, and who is that of interest to? That's one way to approach thinking about funding. So for industry-funded investigator-initiated studies, whether it's in medical device or pharma, you might think about, well, what are the limits to what we know about the therapeutics that are out there, and what are my next questions as a clinician? And that around that point, there may be a study that industry is interested in funding because it extends their knowledge and the practical use or understanding about safety and the effectiveness of their product. And so, each of these companies has mechanisms to apply for funding, and you might do that solely, or you might do that together with a group of investigators. Similarly, thinking about if you're, depending on the stage of your career, you might apply for funding through federal mechanisms like K grants, for example, with mentorship through the NIH. But there are also other pathways that have more to do with sort of healthcare implementation through other parts of the federal government, like AHRQ, for example, is one way to get funding that's more related to how we practice. So I think if you think about, what are the questions that I see that I want to address in my study, or a group of us are seeing that we want to. And then think about it from the perspective, well, what are the interests of these different stakeholders that might be synergistic with, the clinical practice advances that you're seeking to achieve.
And along those lines, either Dr. Mauri and/or Dr. Moliterno, could you speak a little bit about how one makes the transition from doing something as a site investigator, whether it's being the site PI for an industry sponsored trial, or having your own IIT that you're leading at your site, whether it's has funding from industry, or as you pointed out, from a K award or another mechanism, and then transitioning from that to what we very often have to do, which are multi-site trials. And how does one think about doing that, particularly when one is not at the Cleveland Clinic or within the Harvard system that really has or DCRI that has a strong history and track record of doing that. But, as an investigator, you've collected your information for your local site and now really need to, as that next step, do a multi-site trial. How do you recommend people prepare for that?
I mean, maybe I can start and then I'll pass it off to Dave. But I think that it's as a site PI, I think that having that focus on performing well and gets you to stand out as a high enroller with high quality information. That's the first step. But the networking part is really important as well. So making contacts with other investigators. So even if you don't have that mentorship or connection or partnership within your own site, there's a community, out there of people who are investigators who are really excited to mentor others. Not everybody has an institution around them, right, who's active in clinical trials. And I think finding those partners is a really good way of developing as a clinical trialist. And that's true internationally as well.
Yeah, I echo what Laura said. There's almost always somebody else out there with a common interest, and what you're looking for is they have an adequately similar cadre of patients from whom they can get data. I think one easy place is obviously the VA. If you're in any way associated with the VA, obviously there's many VAs around the United States. You can try to network through the VA system. I think, once you start learning an area, whatever it is in medicine or cardiovascular medicine, you're probably going to recognize then who are the top sites or the leading sites that have also published on this topic. And it's surprising. And, I can't remember too many examples in my entire career where I reached out to somebody and got talked to the hand or a cold shoulder. Almost always people are kind and gracious and want to be involved. Even if they can't be involved, they're happy to interact with you and let you know what's going on with them. I think if you're in a really new area, I would say just reaching out, around you to the hospitals around you or to the universities around you. Maybe it's the American College of Cardiology Tennessee chapter or the Massachusetts chapter, and maybe you're presenting a poster at their annual meeting, and then you're trying to gather interest from other hospitals or other cardiologists in that state. So I think there's quite a few opportunities and places for networking. I can remember when I was younger, I would always go to the poster sessions at the AHA, ACC, ESC, and on topics I was very interested in, and just strike up conversations with people to see what they were looking at, what they were interested in, and trying to figure out if I could, help network somehow with them. But I think there's nowadays, especially with social media and the internet, it's pretty easy, I think, to find people who have common interests.
The ACC Tennessee chapter may be an excellent place to network. I would recommend the ACC Nebraska chapter. The annual meeting will be on October 20th at 5 p.m. at the Marriott. Feel free to network with ACC President Ed Fry, who will be the keynote speaker. I'll just put that little plug in there. We have a question in our chat here. Irina Radu asks, how did you decide on a research project? What inspired your research questions? So I wonder if we could ask you each to comment on kind of your inspiration and what helps you pick questions that you can reasonably ask and answer with clinical trials.
Well, gosh, there are just so many examples. You can answer this so many ways. I think it's, Ulster may have been right on many things, but I don't know. You can always find a common thread. Let me say that. So, for example, I was interested in thrombosis and acute coronary syndromes, and in my very early example of working with Helen Hobbs, who was, a world-class lipid biologist and researcher, how would you connect the two together? Well, it didn't matter. I went and talked with her, and ultimately, we came to look at lipoprotein little a and how it may be affecting, plasminogen activity in people having acute myocardial infarction. And so, I think many smart people can really find possibilities to see if there's linkages. And so I wouldn't get too worried about, going to the extreme. I would just, get out there and pursue things and figure out if there's not a relationship in something you're studying, that's okay too. You know, it can be a negative result, but it's good to look at it and to learn along the way.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There, that you'll make good choices and bad choices. We all do. So I think one of the things is, you know, really doubling down on the good choices and then letting go of the bad ones, because you know there are false starts that we all have. And if I look back to my fellowship, you know, before I was really involved in clinical trials per se, I was analyzing data from, you know, from studies rather than running trials, and looking at, you know, how do we look at new coronary stents and predict which ones are going to work, and then later on which ones are going to be safe by looking at quantitative measures. Well, that had a lot of legs because there was a, you know, there was a period where coronary stents really were evolving quickly, and we needed to understand them without putting too many patients into trials or at risk. But, you know, there were other areas that were really way out there that we tried to think about, you know, for instance, can we map out the high risk areas in the coronary tree and somehow prevent vulnerable plaque? And would there be a study that we could do? Well, there's been a lot of work done there. It's been really challenging, and not to say that it won't eventually work, but I think people are still trying, and probably because drugs are so good, right? So there are avenues that it's part of prioritizing your time and focus. It's saying, you know, this is working. I'm gonna go with it, and it's that opportunistic work of what are the problems that are right at the front of what we're seeing with patients, and how do we see what can work and then follow it through.
Okay, just looking at the time, we don't have any more questions in the chat. So I wondered, as sort of a closing-ish question, if I could ask you each just to kind of give your top tip, as it were, for people in the audience. I'll say, hey, people like me. You know, I'm a budding young interventional cardiologist at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. This is cornfields. And I'm interested in clinical research. I think that's a really exciting way I want my career to go forward. What should I do?
Well, you're good at these, Andy, these really open-ended questions that could go anywhere, like the horoscope. So my generic answer may be different from Laura's, but I think you have to become the expert at whatever it is you're interested in. So at the University of Nebraska, you have to be the foremost expert on your topic. Say for you, it's bioresorbable vascular scaffolds, right? Maybe it's CTOs, maybe it's out of hospital cardiac arrest. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But you have to know as much or more than anyone else in your zip code. And you have to, in my opinion, just keep pursuing that, and pursuing that. Because once you are the master of your local domain, you know, then you can start branching out and branching out. But I think if you try to, again, become the master of numerous different areas in interventional cardiology, yeah, it's really tough then to excel in any one of them. So I would, again, figure out if there's a local strength you can play to, or if you've got a very specific interest in something. I would first pursue that with great vigor and passion and learn it the absolute best you can, and then see where that takes you.
Terrific. Okay, so becoming the expert in one area and focusing on the local strengths, or what resources are locally available. Okay. Dr. Moore, you should know that I'm taking notes here.
Well, I think it's hard to argue with what Dave just said. I think it's great advice. I guess what I would add to that is maybe to complement being the local expert, is again that networking and support. So what I mean by that is finding others even outside of your institution who have either similar interests or it can be very relevant to get complementary interests. I mean, I think about some of the work that I did, was reaching out to statisticians who I recognized they had methods that were really sophisticated, using them in other areas that could be applied. Or it could be, when I look at so many of the advances in cardiology, they involve combining work from interventionalists and non-interventionalists that are not necessarily otherwise collaborating, or across surgeons and general cardiologists. Many examples of just breakthroughs that come from collaboration across complementary experts. So that would be maybe complementary to what Dave just said. Finding those kind of like-minded, interested collaborators who bring something new, and one and one is more than two when you're working together.
Okay, so networking and developing a support system, building a community within your area of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Okay. Anything to add, Dr. Smythe?
I would just thank both Dr. Moliterno and Dr. Mauri for sharing their insight and their expertise in this area with all of this. As always, I learn from both of you every time that you present, and this was a wonderful learning opportunity for me, and great advice for me to pass on to others who are trying to follow in your footsteps in cardiology and other disciplines across medicine and surgery.
Wonderful.
You are both inspirations to all of us.
Indeed. Thank you so much. And thank you also to our audience for attending. This will be recorded, so you can listen later and share. And again, one more shameless plug for the academic section events at ACC 22 coming up, in particular the Heart Tank for the cardiovascular investigators. It's going to be an excellent session. Hope to see you all there. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great evening.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.